Hello and welcome to World Civilization 2. We are on chapter 33 and we are talking about advanced industrial society today. Okay, so we open up with the last chapter. We were talking about 1848 in the year of revolution, and that was also the year that the Communist Manifesto was written. Now you have to really understand something. First of all, Karl Marx was a fantastic writer. He was terrific. His words are beautiful to read. Secondly, the communism that both China and Russia called communism really weren't the same flavor as Karl Marx. If you really study Karl Marx and his life, and there is a section in here that we'll get to, it's absolutely fantastic. And how, one of his quotes was, we aren't here to understand the world, we're just here to change it. And he really was trying to change it for the good. And we'll talk about, the barriers to that. Okay. So there was the first wave of industrial revolution, and then the second wave of industrial revolution. You have to understand that Germany really took over for that second wave of industrial revolution and surpassed Great Britain by leaps and bounds, just in technology and their colleges and their output of scientists and that sort of thing. And that created a whole lot of upheaval and jealousy for both England and France. In fact, some historians truly believe that World War I was started because the Germans were looked at like they were, this barbaric tribe from years ago, and the French and the English were like the sophisticated ones. And then all of a sudden, after Martin Luther nailed 95 Theses to the wall and said everyone should read, pouring education to a country is always a good thing, all right? Educating, free education of any kind raises everyone. So that's exactly what happened. And Germany was surpassing them in economics, in technology, and in the Industrial Revolution, and they were not very happy about that. Okay, so remember that. Education in history always helps your country. All right. All right, so German technology, we just talked about that. There was a lot of new energy sources, and your book talks about that: oil, electricity, that sort of thing. Talks about German engineers, scientific research. It talks about London had a great exhibition. There were 6 million people that came, just kind of, showcasing photography, machinery, electricity, special trains and ships were, they were shown and on display and that sort of thing. All right. What's really cool is a huge sum at the time. The proceeds were used to construct permanent exhibits in South Kensington, including the Victoria and Albert Art Museum and Science Museum and the Natural History Museum. So the funds from this went to do the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I have not seen yet, but I will someday. I have been to the Natural History Museum, which is absolutely maybe the most fantastic thing I've ever seen in my life. And I sure didn't get to spend enough time there, so I need to go back. Okay, so Industrial Revolution, capitalism, all this stuff is booming. There's some problems because capitalism without laws and boundaries creates extreme oppression, extreme use of people for financial gain, out of control. So some different things that happen. Urbanization, a lot of people were moving from the country to the urban area. They needed organized labor, social reforms. Children were being used. Okay, and we talked about that as early as 5 years old, 5 in the morning to 9 at night, and they had some changes. Women and children were being used and paid way less for the same jobs. All right, so this oppression, this greedy capitalism that is just more concerned about building a nation by breaking the backs of the lower class and of children and of women, and it is a huge problem. All right. mass democratic politics as well. And that's really interesting because it talks about most people were for male suffrage, males voting, but there were a few that were not. Only Russia, Hungary, and Italy stood firm against universal male suffrage as late as 1905. Wow. You have suffragettes and pictures of them, women wanting voting rights. Please remember that Great Britain had voting rights for women before the US did in 1920. And then you have 24 years later where France did not allow the women to vote until 1944. The law was passed and they couldn't participate until 1945. All right. What really, really was a tragedy that came out of greedy capitalism was a split of the lower class and the middle class. The middle class began looking after itself. The lower class really had no one to fight for them other than, labor unions, which they really didn't take the power and influence that they needed to keep people safe. Let's see. We talk about Marx. He was a German Jew. His father was very, very wealthy and he owned a factory. And Karl Marx really saw how the masses were used they were seen as masses, not as human beings, not as individuals. And he was against that. He thought it was wrong. So his radical politics, he met a man and colleague named Friedrich Engels, and he wrote the Communist Manifesto. And I know it gets a lot of bad stereotyping because of, the Red Scare and Joseph McCarthy taking it way out of line and just really stereotyping it in a horrible way. But it really was talking about the bourgeois capitalism abuses, how they were abusing the lower class. I mean, whole countries were built on greedy capitalism. At first it was slavery, the waves of slavery, honestly. And then it was the lower class, and the lower class actually built these nations, but they were never given the rights and protections of just basic medical and that sort of thing. Basic medical, basic places to live that weren't full of germs and stagnant air and breeding grounds for terrible diseases that would kill you. So that's really important. Again, we talked about private and public sphere. Women were no longer really allowed to participate in the public arena where they had a little more wiggle room maybe before. Now they were put in the private sphere, home, family, church. Now lower class women had more rights. They had more lower and poor women had more rights of who to marry, and they could also work. But lower middle class, and upper class women were controlled highly by society. A lot of that had to do with the Victorian era as well. Okay, Karl Marx talks about him. He loved philosophy. He went to the University of Berlin. And he really saw how working people were just, living in just filth and pollution, and the tenement housing, there was no air and they were cramped, and it was just, they needed these workers, but they treated them horrifically. And it got so bad that sometimes, women and children worked exhausting jobs for extremely low pay. And without warning, you might get fired because someone down the street agreed to, work for less wages than you did. There was no leveling of the playing field by the government intervention, and there really, really needed to be some guidelines, some rules where greedy capitalism couldn't spin out of control and destroy people, masses of people. And that's really, really have to investigate that. So he talked about, a proletariat revolution, and he also wrote a book called Das Kapital, or Kapital, the Bible of Scientific Socialism. Okay, he organized a lot of things for international working men. Okay, he died in the same poverty in which he lived. So he came from wealth, because he believed that the workers deserved more, were people, didn't want to dehumanize them for profit. He lived a life of poverty. What's really interesting also is that he had several children, but he treated his daughters very, very well and really encourage their education and equality. And, there's so many things not known about Karl Marx that, just as we look at someone in history, we see their good and their bad. We also need to do that same thing with every historical figure, the good things they did, or what's the stereotypes, dig underneath and deconstruct what really they were about. Okay. All right, and I want to make this statement clear. If someone loves Karl Marx and loves his reading, which I do, I think his writing is just absolutely beautiful. That does not mean that you're a communist. I just really want to get that out there. I remember growing up, I had some relatives that would say how much they thought Karl Marx's writings were beautiful, and I would be told by other family members that they were communists, and don't talk to them. And now that's so silly. I am so not a communist, but his writings are just absolutely eloquent and beautiful, and just seeing what was behind them. Okay, syndicalism is a form of, it's one of your vocabulary words, it is a form of political action by the working class. It is founded on the belief that only the laboring class and peasants should govern because only they contribute the substantial asset to society through their work. Again, nations are built on workers, and it's extremely important that they have a say in the government, because that's when you find revolutions taking place. And they looked at this association, called themselves the syndicate, represent the economic and social interests of its members. Okay, the Labor Party comes on the scene. Talks about revisionism. By the coming of World War I, revisionism came. This is an adaptation of Marxist socialism, and it's an aim to just have laws passed, recognizing these abuses and changing it and making it equal and fair and taking care of your people, rather than having a bloody revolution. So revisionism was putting laws in place for protection, making capitalism more friendly and not so greedy, and breaking the backs of the working class. I don't know if you've ever worked in a factory. I worked in a factory in college. It might have been the best thing I ever did. I have never worked so hard in my entire life, and I'll be really honest, I knew I was going to get my college education. I was, I want to say between my junior and senior year. But I've never been treated so poorly, and just almost like dirt, pretty much. And so I have great respect for people who work in factories. I have great respect for people who work so hard to build the cars and the things that run this society. And they need to be paid and protected and taken care of, just like everyone else. That's a democratization, where it's like a leveling of the playing field, and no longer this hierarchy where the lower class is considered, completely worthless. Okay, we have immigrants and who was moving. People weren't just moving to the New World. They were moving to Australia, New Zealand, Russia. Why did they leave? They were seeking better economic situations, social mobility. Some people could not move up and down the ladder of social mobility. Most were not very poor or ignorant. They had some relatives, and they were just trying to, some of the skilled craftsmen couldn't maneuver within the European confines. So, moving to the New World helped with that. Also, we don't really understand nobility, here in America, but, it's a different layer of moving up and down the classes. A disproportionate number of Jews from Russia Empire, including Poland, were fleeing for ethnic persecution. All right, and really the condition of the cities where the workers were just an infestation, of germs and diseases, and it needed to change. Okay, that pretty much concludes chapter 33. Thank you. Have a lovely night.